Hi, and welcome back to STS 1451. Today we are going to be discussing disability and disability activism. Our keywords include the American with Disabilities Act, Section 504 of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, different perspectives of disability, malpractice, not dead yet, neurotypical, autism spectrum disorder, autism speaks, anti-vaxxer, normal and abnormal, the social model of disability, disability activism, and ableism. These are all terms that you can glean from our readings. What is disability? The biomedical model of disability assumes that there is an impairment within a disabled person themselves and looks to try to correct those disabilities where they can. In some cases, like in Chris Gabbard's story about his son, that disability might have been caused by malpractice and they could trace it to a specific thing that happened in a hospital. In other cases, impairments can arise in myriad other ways. But whatever the cause of your disability, disability activists have suggested a different model that opposes the biomedical. It's called the social model of disability. Instead of focusing on the impairment of the individual person, it looks at social impairments that make it difficult to move through the world when you're a person with a disability. So they might look at the environment and the way that buildings might be inaccessible. They might look at attitudes like prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination. And they might look at organizations and see the way that ableist assumptions are built into these structures. One example could be Cornell's campus. Cornell was built on a very, very hilly surface. I was actually in a wheelchair for several months before I first moved to Ithaca and Cornell, and I was no longer in a wheelchair by the time I got there, but I couldn't help when I was walking up those very steep hills, but think I could not have been able to move my wheelchair through these spaces. Obviously, there are accommodations for students with disabilities, but those were designed after the fact in the form of shuttle buses and things like that. When the original campus was built, they were thinking about things like beauty and aesthetics of the place itself, and they weren't imagining disabled people attending the university and needing to get around. So we're able to accommodate those social barriers so that students of any ability can attend. This is one definition of the medical versus social model. The website I drew it from is linked below. Disabled people have arrived at a different model to help understand the situation. They're challenging people to give up the idea that disability is a medical problem requiring treatment, but to understand instead that disability is a problem of exclusion from ordinary life. The social model does not deny the existence of impairments that may affect disabled people's daily lives, but it shifts the emphasis onto the real barriers that affect participation. The social model of disability demonstrates that removing barriers for disabled people benefits everyone. This happens by making the built environment more accessible, thus assisting parents with buggies or strollers, as we say in the US, people with heavy luggage, older people, etc. So if you've ever navigated around a city with a suitcase in hand trying to find your hotel, and it's easier to get up onto a sidewalk because of a curb cut, you can thank disability activism for that ease. As with other developments that we've seen, advances in scientific medicine have helped people with disabilities. Consider what Johnson says about the extended lifespan of people with Down syndrome. So the biological model of scientific medicine has definitely gained traction for people with disabilities and other impairments. Policies have also evolved to help, like the ADA and its predecessor, Section 504 of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act. Did these laws immediately help people? It's a big deal to get a law on the books that fights against discrimination of disabled people, but as Meyerson said, no, having these laws passed did not immediately change the lives of people with disabilities. There were still sit-ins and a lot of advocacy with the US Supreme Court in order for able-bodied people who are making these policies and decisions to understand what discrimination really looks like for someone living with a disability. Ableism is discrimination in favor of able-bodied people. Charis Hill's piece talks more about this. One form of ableism is the assumption that disabilities are inherently tragic. How did our text from today confront that biased assumption? This is something Chris Gabbard specifically talks about, the assumption that people would have when they looked at his son, August, who had profound disabilities, and think that it would be better to be dead than to be alive. And in fact, Gabbard talks about an organization that's called Not Dead Yet. that is specifically a disability rights organization that fights against that idea. As it says here, it's a national grassroots disability rights group that opposes legalization of assisted suicide and euthanasia as deadly forms of discrimination. Like Gabbard, this organization sees the humanity and joy in people that are living even with profound disabilities that it's difficult for able-bodied people to understand. Not every organization appeals to people with disabilities in the same way. Note the way that Kerchak talks about Autism Speaks in her article about having autism versus the measles. Kerchak discusses the perspective of people with autism spectrum disorder. She says, take Autism Speaks, for example. The world's most prominent autism-related charity has a pretty cuddly exterior. Celebrities toss money at it. People wear blue things to help it raise awareness. It claims to help autistic people and their families. Why would anyone question its intentions? It would be absolutely absurd to run a charity for people you hate, after all, right? But Autism Speaks isn't really a charity for autistic people. It's a charity for neurotypical people who have been afflicted by the horror of having autistic people in their lives. Pay attention to that language there, the horror of having autistic people in their lives. She continues, since its inception in 2005, Autism Speaks has perpetuated the idea that people with autism are a burden and somehow lost, and they refuse to listen to any actual autistic people who disagree with their party line. It supported a number of dangerous and dubious treatments like electroshock therapy and chelation, a lead poisoning treatment that has many risks and no proven benefit as an ASD cure, all in the name of making autistic people appear more neurotypical. Its official statements consistently refuse to acknowledge any humanity in autistic people or recognize that their families experience anything other than abject misery. So much like Gabbard discusses in his piece, Kerchak talks about how neurotypical people look at someone with a difference like autism and imagine that it has to be worse, it has to be horrible for them and their family. They're measuring against their own ableism, their own body, their own mind, and seeing something worse instead of seeing difference. And part of the reason that disability activists have coined terms like neurotypical is to challenge the idea of normal and force us to recognize that there's a spectrum of how able-bodied we are, or a spectrum of mental illness. Kerchak's article discusses another bias of ableism, the anti-vaxxers' idea that a horrible physical illness like measles is worse than autism. This perspective sees only a neurotypical person as fully human, a perspective that Gabbard also addresses. This is something that we have to be wary of in our own writing and pay attention to in other people's writing that we're analyzing. What are the assumptions that undermine it or underwrite it? It might, in the case of Autism Speaks, undermine what they're trying to say if they're not talking about people with autism as fully human. So another key binary here is normal versus abnormal. We've already discussed how normal can be used to erase women and Black, Indigenous, or people of color from medical discourses and the detrimental effects of those erasures. This erasure can be even more dramatic in the case of people with disabilities. Sees Hill's discussion of weaponization of ableism. So all the way back when we first started reading Warner and Cunningham, we read about the rise of the idea of the norm, and now we're starting to see what this normalization of medicine has cost us. By setting an able-bodied, white, cis, hetero man as the norm, there are a lot of people whose bodies seem abnormal, and when the world is built to the specifications of that norm, it's actually more difficult to move through the world if you don't have one of those bodies. That affects women, that affects people of color, and that definitely affects people with disabilities. Next time, we're going to specifically discuss AIDS activism and think about how it relates to activism in the age of COVID-19. We really, as our readings have said, can learn a lot from disability activism and from challenging the norms that first developed with the rise of scientific medicine. Thank you for reading and getting through another lecture. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Goodbye.